Hello everyone, welcome back to the Grim Dawn build guide. This is part 2 of the generalized builds on Witchblade that I use whenever I'm not going for a hyper-specific build and I'm just kind of building as I go along. This usually relies heavily on green items, which if you're lucky are going to be better than epic or legendaries anyways, but that's beside the point. So I'm going to be going in chronological order from the previous video, obviously. So, first off is the nearly solo soldier, but with the addition of the occultist's Curse of Frailty, which shifts the solo soldier from looking at physical and pierce to looking at physical and bleed. While this doesn't hugely change the skills you would build in that combination, in that specific look of Witchblade, compared to solo soldier, you literally just emphasizing bleed damage, which overlaps with pierce damage a lot of the times. There is a decent change in the constellations you go for, right? So while the skills don't change too much, you're literally only setting aside 11 points to max Curse of Frailty for the most amount of resistance reduction. This is very different constellations. In the solo soldier, I recommend it as Raka because she increases physical and pierce damage, which is great for a solo soldier who's typically going to either be going defensive, or if the solo soldier is going for damage, it's going to be looking at that physical pierce combination, and Azraka is great for that. But in this build, I usually go for Oleron because he gives you some really great increases in physical, internal trauma, and bleeding damage. And again, there's a lot of overlap with that if you look. Again, just to recap, if you're going melee, you have Blade Arc, regardless of what you're going for, fighting Formworks, right? We also have Deadly Momentum, which increases both pierce, physical, and internal trauma damage. You've got bleed damage out of internal trauma, just as a reminder, right? I believe you get internal trauma here, you don't get bleed, excuse me. But you get some bleed out of Force Wave as well. So, at baseline, I like to go for Oleron, which is a bit of an investment, to be honest. But let's talk about it. First off, obviously, we're going for Assassin's Blade. Obviously, Assassin's Mark, technically, but the constellation is called Assassin's Blade, right? Basically default, same as Solo Soldier. But what happens from here... Well, let me actually get some of the constellations out of the way that you're pretty much always going to be looking for. I like getting the Falcon, physical and bleed damage increase. I like getting the Night Talon. And there's a specific reason for the Night Talon, because if we get the Night Talon, we put this point into the red crossroads, we are almost there to the Huntress. Of course, we have the 3 green we need right here, so if you want to temporarily put a green there, and then go ham on the Huntress, which you want to do because this rend here, it decreases enemy bleeding resistance, so we really want the Huntress as well. Now, whether or not you finish the Huntress is a completely different conversation, okay? Let's go on ahead and hypothetical this, right? We finish the Huntress, we pull the point out of the green, because she's, of course, carrying that by herself, and then we grab the Owl. If I could just... there we go. And then, of course, we have 15 purple. I really like to grab the Empty Throne, because it's fulfilling a very similar idea to the Sailor's Guide with blue, right? Where this is just 4 points for 5 blue and gives you some great defensive buffs. Same thing with this, right? We have some defensive abilities, slow resistance. We've got some pierce resistance here. We've got the really significant reduced freeze duration. And then, of course, we have reduced stun duration, which is also really big. This is really helpful on hardcore, but this is more about getting that 5 purple for as cheap a cost as possible, right? So this is generally where I go with this, but these are just the constellations that I'm always going to be using, whether I'm melee or ranged. But from this point forward, you have to make that decision, alright? Are you going to go ranged, or are you going to go melee? Because this changes the series of next constellations. This changes how you get your yellow. This changes what ultimate constellation you're going for. I'm going to talk about the melee first, because it's the slightly more involved pathing, so to speak. So, if I'm going melee, I'm going to grab the Lotus at this point, which is going to get me some yellow and some green, right? Which we want. And then we're going to grab the Lion, and then we're going to pull this point out of here, and then, of course, we have access to Oleron, right? Which we can go here for the internal trauma, or you can go here for the bleeding, which I typically do. I don't necessarily always go for this point here, and I very rarely go for Blind Fury because it activates on critical attack. If you want it, go for it. It is very strong. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not dissing this as a skill. It's just not really high up on my priorities, right? But now at this particular point, we are going melee. We need more green. Well, I like to go for the Fox because the Fox gives a huge boost in bleed, right? Bleeding damage, and now we can get Mogdragon, and I don't go full on into Mogdragon. I usually stop at the nose. Why? Well, it's very terribly simple. This point here increases your resistances, and while it is a nice boost in resistances, that's also not strictly necessary, because these are pretty easily found resistances. I find myself not really needing to go out of my way to find elemental resistance a lot of the time. Bleeding resistance isn't that hard to get a hold of either, even with random drops, and the Howl of Mogdragon, while it's a nice boost in bleeding damage, isn't necessarily worth the investment points, right? If you really wanted to combine everything here, it's actually really simple to put a single point in Crossroads and put some points into the soldier here and get almost up to here. But you don't even necessarily need this if you wanted to go here as well, right? You don't need these full last constellations. You can go part of the way, right, if you really want to, or you could splash in some of these points into some other constellation that's going to give you some benefit. For example, you could grab the Dryad if you were really interested or so inclined. You could grab the Stag if you were so inclined. Alright, that's totally up to you. In fact, instead of even putting points into the Unknown Soldier, if you really wanted to, you could very easily, let's pull this point out of Oloran really quick, you could rearrange this where you go with the Stag instead, which is going to give you physical and bleed. Leave this, and then not go for the Lion, right? You still have 3 points to spare. So you can still you could finish out Mogdragon if you wanted, you could grab Blind Fury and his head over here, you could grab both of these and then grab these resistances. Since Howl of Mogdragon is still not hugely important, you could do that, right? You've got all these options that you can run, it really depends. But I didn't pick up the Stag by accident, because if you're looking to go ranged, rather than getting the Lotus, you get the Stag instead, right, to increase that bleed damage and that physical damage a little bit, and then you just run the line, you can go for the Unknown Soldier as well, but even then, you still don't even necessarily need to run that, right? That's totally optional. Incidentally, by the way, if you are going ranged, you could swap the Night Talon for the Mantis. You would have to get the red Crossroads first, but you could just reverse, you could go for the Mantis instead of the Night Talon if you're going with a ranged version of this, right? And then you're running 3 different damage types at the same time: physical, pierce, and bleed. Again, I'm not the biggest fan of triple damage types. There are certain circumstances in which that's fine, but generally speaking, I'm not going to go out of my way for it, but it's totally up to you. But that's also very effective as well, alright? That's completely on the table. But you can really swing between any of these 3 constellations, very easily from that baseline that I presented. And just to remind you what the baseline is, let's pull these all out for a hot second. Let's pull you out too. And we'll pull these out because these aren't strictly necessary. From here, you can go into any of the constellations you need that will get you to, at minimum, Oloran, and either the Unknown Soldier or Mogdragon, and you'd be able to fill out one of these easily. I don't recommend it because you don't need to, but if you particularly like any one of these skills, whether it's Mogdragon's Howl, Living Shadow, or the Blind Fury, totally your choice. My favorite of these 3 is Blind Fury, for reference, by the way, especially if I'm running a 2-handed build, but go with the one you like, and you can use remaining points to fill out some other end constellation, right? It's really not that difficult. Again, we are deviating from Izraka here very specifically, but it's very potentially effective, right? But what about the elemental version, right? Well, the elemental version, which is where you're basically relying on the Crow and Cadence to do the bulk of your damage, this is actually really quite interesting to get as well, where you're really primarily looking for Altos, and then you splash a couple of points into the Blind Sage. Again, whether or not you want Elemental Seeker is totally up to you. I actually don't go for this a whole lot because, honestly, I'm just not fond of this skill lasting only 3 seconds. Just not the biggest fan of it. Personal preference. I know it's basically like a living explosive. That's fine. Not my cup of tea. But anyways, immediately go into the Danger Noodle, because right here at the end, 20% reduced target's elemental resistances for 3 seconds. Great. Lovely. Love to see that. Now, because the elemental Witchblade runs off of Cadence into Discord, you are using a melee weapon. Not a melee weapon. You are using your auto attacks a lot, and I really like to grab the Ghoul for this, because this plus 22% attack speed combos so well with Cadence. You go basically under half health, boom, Ghoulish Hunger activates, you're hitting harder, that extra damage is being converted to health. It's absolutely insane. Love Ghoulish Hunger with Cadence. It's gross. Try it at home. But, of course, this is just going to give us the 6 red we need for Altos. We still need green, we still need blue, right? Now, the blue is, frankly, pretty easy. I'm really fond of Tsunami, because, of course, this is Cold and Lightning, which is elemental damage, which we love to see, and it puts us a mere 2 points away right there, obviously, right? How you get those last 2 points is, once more, totally up to you. If you want to go into the Lizard, because he only costs 3 points, or the Eel, because he only costs 3 points, totally an option. Right? You can even go for the Eel. Actually, let's go ahead and prototype the Eel. Now, let's stick with Tsunami, alright? We'll talk about the Eel in a little bit, but let's go for the Lizard for now, alright? Just for a second. You could also go for the Scarab if you really wanted to. I don't really recommend it because there's not really a whole lot of benefit for you specifically, unless you are very specifically using a shield. But anyways, back to the point. Put a single point here in green. We get Scholar's Light. We get Quill. Both of these are increasing elemental damage, right? But we also want the purple out of Quill, because we are going to want a certain amount of purple to get to at least some of the Blind Sage, right? So we do have that. I really like to pick up the Raven, by the way, for a lot of green, because, again, she needs 18 green. So this is easily going to push us past the green we need for Altos, but additionally, it gives your pets an increase in lightning damage, which is the only damage type the Crow does. But you can see once we complete the Raven here, we have access to Altos, so we go on ahead for that. Well, we don't technically need that point. This is just an increase in health with some Chaos Resistance. You don't technically need that. But you absolutely want Hand of Altos for that 20% reduced target elemental resistance. Absolutely fantastic time. Again, 20% weapon damage here. As effective as Cadence is with two-handed weapons, this is also going to benefit from a two-handed weapon. Not as much, obviously, it's only 20% weapon damage, but even so, running a two-handed weapon on this build is just absolutely fantastic, but we're really close to Blind Sage. We need a fair bit of purple to be sure, yes, but our green is pretty close. We could very easily, in fact I often do, just grab this spider here, bunch of gray stats here. We can pull this point out of here from the crossroads, and we still have all the green we need, and now we just need some purple. Of course, gotta go for the old classic of the owl here. Great time. And now for the last bits of purple, because we still need 10 purple. I actually usually go for the Harpy, because you are going to get some cold damage. The Harpy is particularly useful if you're running either a sword, since many swords have some amount of pierce conversion, or if you're running, again, a gun. You could also alternatively go for the Mantis as well, also an option, right? Very much a potentially effective option. But now you can see we can access the Blind Sage. Again, I just go up to these. I go over here, increasing all of my elemental damage. We, of course, have the skill Disruption Protection, which is really nice, and the increased crit damage. We have elemental damage here. Again, I don't necessarily always go for this. You can choose not to. But you might be wondering, well, alright, I have 2 spare points. What do I want to use them on? You can use them on the see here, you can grab this very easily. Obviously, you can grab this last point on Ultos, or if you went for the eel instead, you would have 4 full points. You could use that on a lot of different things if you really wanted to. You could increase your fire damage with some points into the Magi, get up to his head, right? Or you can go here for some increased attack speed. You can get some burn damage out of this right here. You could put some points into this guy because he's going to increase your elemental damage. Also very much a possibility. This is something I recommend if you are going for the shield, because obviously you can, with 4 points, boom, elemental damage, boom, shield damage blocked, boom, healing effects increase armor, and then bam, more shield damage blocked, a bit more elemental damage. You don't really necessarily need this. Yeah, it increases a lot of your elemental damage. You could very easily get, you could rework, instead of using the ghoul, you might go for the harpy, right? If you really wanted to, they're the same point cost, get some extra red. Wouldn't really make a huge difference, other than being able to maybe go for... it doesn't make any difference at all, other than being a bit more defensive, but you can absolutely go for that. Again, you can drop some of the points here, drop this point here. You could get up to here if you really wanted to. Again, it's really going to come down to your personal preferences, but this is generally how I'm approaching the Elemental Witchblade, right? It works pretty well with this setup. Again, we have the Hand of Altos reducing enemy resistances. We have the Danger Noodle reducing enemy resistances. Just a great time. Absolutely fantastic. And it's, again, a bit flexible on that, right? But now we have the difficult and uncomfortable Constellation conversation. Because, unfortunately, for occultists, the resistance reductions for a variety of the occultists' damage types is tied into damage types the occultist generally doesn't do. What do I mean by this? Well, come with me on a mystical journey. Let's look at, first off, the famous rumor. Here is our poison and acid resistance reduction, locked into cold damage, which the occultist doesn't organically do. Second case in point. We have the Will of Ratosh, which decreases vitality resistance, but it's locked into aether damage, which the occultist also does not do, right? What we do have, though, is chaos damage locked to fire damage, which the occultist does do. And this is one of the reasons I was talking about why I really like Sigil of Consumption, is because you grab destruction. Yeah, you're not going out of your way for fire damage, but at the very least you are reducing that fire resistance. Alright. Now, whether or not you actually want to go for these is entirely up to you, but this is really why, whenever I'm playing Occultist, I tend to grab Curse of Frailty, or more specifically, the Vulnerability, because you have to go pretty out of your way for mediocre rewards on some of these constellations. Let me demonstrate. Alright, so we're going with... this is going to cover all 3 of the generalized builds I talked about where you went for possession. All 3 of them, right? You're looking at that poison vitality, you're looking at that chaos damage, all of that. This is going to cover all of those because they all use pretty similar constellations. I'll talk about some mild variants, like the Retaliation build is going to focus a little more heavily on poison and acid, which is going to look at slightly different constellation choices. But by and large, this is going to apply to all 3 of them. So right off the top, we're running right into the Crossroads. Now, if you're not doing the Retaliation build, you're actually going to start probably at the Crossroads for mostly chaos damage reasons, vitality damage reasons, but even so, you can still go with the green, go into the bat, and grab the vitality damage here, especially if you intend on using the plague. The bat is a really great option, but we're going to run the poison first, alright? So we're going to go on ahead and go for the Eye of the Guardian here, chaos and poison damage, which we love to see. Go for the Scorpion, which is going to be a lot more poison acid damage, which we also love to see. Now for these for all three of these last three builds that I talked about in the previous episode, we are specifically going for the Abomination. We don't really need anything else. I very strongly recommend against going Ratosh. Even if you want as much resistance reduction as possible, I recommend against Ratosh, simply because he is very intensive in his requirements. Because not only do you have to have 10 green, 6 red, which is easy, that's not a problem, but 6 yellow as well, but you also have to go all the way through the entirety of the constellation. This is a lot of dedication just to get vitality resistance. Okay? Yes, there's life resistance there as well. That's not the biggest deal. That is a very heavy skill point investment here, and you're going to see by getting to the Abomination that we're going to have some slightly limited choices here, right? We're going for the Eye of the Guardian, we've got the Scorpion, go right for the Spider for the green, because of course the Abomination takes up a lot of green. You can go for the Bat as well if you really want. We're going to do so for this example here, right? Great, we have the green, we have some red. Where you want to go from here is going to be up to you. You can go into the Fiend for some fire and chaos damage. I'm not averse to that, right? That's a pretty good deal. You can actually, theoretically, if you really wanted to, you could go for the Fiend instead of the Eye of the Guardian if you're not using Poison Acid. That's one of the choices I was talking about earlier, where you would deviate slightly. Instead of Eye of the Guardian, you could go for Fiend, right? If you are going for that Vitality Chaos damage. If you're not going heavy on the Poison Acid, you don't want Eye of the Guardian, you're going to want the Fiend. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but you are going to go for the Vulture, right? That's going to be 5 red. You can see we're really close here. Put the single point here and go right on in here. We're going to increase... We're going to go for both of these. Again, you don't necessarily need these end ones, so we're going to actually leave those out, but you are going to want everything leading up to those, right? Now, the reason why you may not necessarily want those, because those points are going to be fairly important for going for the resistance reductions we really want. Now, again, I do very strongly recommend at least Eldritch Fire. We are getting a lot of nice chaos resistance. We get some movement speed reduction, which, again, if you are using Sigil of Consumption, really helps to increase the amount of time an enemy can spend in there if you're not putting it right at your feet. So that is fairly nice, just as an aside. Now, you have to decide, do you want to go for Murmur so you can get the Poison Acid resistance? Or are you feeling particularly spicy and want to go for Ratosh? Alright? Let's talk about it. Let's talk Murmur first. Alright, because the 6 blue is actually significantly easier to get. You slap a blue in the crossroads here, and you know, you don't even need to go for that. You can just go for the eel. Boom. And relatively effectively, you can go right for Rumor. The really big benefit of this, and this is why I often do this despite the relative going out of my way of this, is simply because Rumor is like halfway through the constellation. You don't need to go all the way to these 2 points on the side. If you really don't want to, you can. You don't need to, right? This is just good stats. This is good stats. That also combines, by the way, really well with the eel. This is a 3% chance to dodge everything, right? And this is an equal 2%, 2%. You're getting a 5% dodge chance at base, and then you have acid damage increase here, of course. So you have that option. You can also, by the way, at this point, you can go for the Manticore, right? You get some poison acid damage here. In a couple of different places, you get the acid spray potential, which is really nice. You will actually see there 28 reduced targets resistances, which is really, really nice. I really like the Manticore, but we're going to leave the Manticore alone for a second because I want to demonstrate how difficult it can be to get to Ratosh. But you can, actually, let's quickly demonstrate this because you can very easily just pop right on in here, get that acid spray. You don't necessarily need the foot here. We're not looking for the points out of the Manticore. We have all the points we need, right? We've got to the Abomination. At this particular point, you could actually pretty happily walk away. You've got Chaos Resistance Reduction, Fire Resistance Reduction, which only really matters for the Sigil, but still. And then you've got, of course, your Poison Acid Reduction, and you've got the Abomination. You have 4 points left over. You can finish the Abomination. Hell, you could even finish Murmur if you really wanted to. I don't know why you would want to, but you can. Right, you could also devote some points into the Fiend. If you didn't choose the Fiend over the Eyeball, you could put a couple points into the Eyeball if you really wanted to, right? Totally an option, but the Fiend is not necessarily a bad option, right? You've got chaos damage there, you've got some spirit, which is nice, chaos resistance, more chaos damage, and the infamous flame torrent, which is also, by the way, optional if you're not using this for points. But anyways, so you have all those options, right? But let's talk Ratosh. Let's say you want Ratosh, you want to get that vitality damage. Well, that's a little bit of a conversation. All right, why is that a little bit of a conversation? Well, primarily because yellow has this interesting problem where there's not really, the only real serious 5-point yellow constellation is the crane, which is really nice, right? It's obviously a little bit more involved than the eel is because you're actually pulling 5 points out of this, and then you need to go all the way through Ratosh, which leaves you with 5 points left over. Again, you still can get to the Manticore, which is, again, really, really nice, but you can see where you are putting in quite a bit more point investment here, and you're not really leaving with any serious leftovers, right? You are going to have to make a concrete choice as to which two resistance reductions you want. Right, and this is my only real problem with the Occultist, because right now I have put the points into Slayle's Witchblade. Pulling these points out still isn't going to quite get you here, so you are basically choosing two, right? You're choosing the Slayle's Witchblade, and you can only get the Slayle's Witchblade for practically free because you already have all of the affinity requirements just working your way up to the Abomination. But Murmur is 6 blue, which has nothing to do with the Abomination. The Abomination only requires green and red, and Ratosh requires 6 yellow, which again is out of your way in terms of points, right? In terms of affinity. So, getting the Slayle's Witchblade is free, basically. You have to put the points into the Constellation, obviously, but this is, you don't need to go out of your way to get this. This is something you can very easily get on your way to the Abomination with absolutely no issues, right? Hell, if you really wanted to, once you got Slayle's Witchblade, you could actually pull these 2 points out, not the yellow, pull these 2 points out, and you can get a spare 2 points, right? Which is fine, but at the end of the day, that's still not going to be enough to pull all of these, obviously, right? You could, again, get the points to grab the 2 skills at the end of the Abomination here with absolutely no issues. But, again, you are making a choice. Do you want the poison acid resistance reduction? Or do you want the vitality and life leech resistance reductions? That's going to be totally up to you. And again, I personally don't necessarily go for either of these. I will often deviate and go for some other things instead. For example, if I'm using a two-handed, sorry, not a two-handed weapon, a ranged weapon, I keep confusing the requirements for the Hydra and the Squid, the Kraken, but if you're using a ranged weapon, I'll go for the Hydra. If instead I'm going for the, if I know I'm going to use Sigil of Consumption, I might even put some points into the Magi, because I already know that that does fire damage, and, you know, it doesn't hurt to grab Fissure, which is going to help you a little bit as well. Instead of going for either Ratosh here or whatever, it's pretty easy. Instead of putting the 5 points here, the 6 points here, the 7th point here, right? You go into the Hydra, you grab a couple of points out of the Magi. You could theoretically rush Fissure if you wanted to and drop points out of the Hydra. Let me actually demonstrate that really quick. Right? I always get at least this, because again, this reduced target resistance is really nice, because that's resistances across the board. But let's pull this out here, right? Let's pretend I'm using a ranged weapon. I'll go on ahead and go max Hydra, then we can grab the Fissure here. We can go for either some burning damage here, which is what I usually do, or you can go, I'm sorry, the fire damage. You can go for the burning damage if you want. If you're using, what do you call that? Slayle's Witchfire, that's the one. If you're using Slayle's Witchfire, this particular point is going to be better, obviously, because of the increased attack speed. But if I'm not using a ranged weapon, then this isn't even necessary, obviously, right? I might put some points into Olzewin's Torch. Again, I am really fond of the Sigil of Consumption. I'm already reducing fire resistance, why the hell not, right? That's a pretty easy grab. Right? Easy. Incidentally, by the way, if you want to use the Hellhound, This is also really nice for that, because the Hellhound has an aura that can increase fire damage. I don't recommend it for the Witchblade, but this is going to come up in future videos, right? You could pull this point out here, grab this if you really want to. You've got all kinds of fun little options, because I don't necessarily go for Murmur or Ratatosh. If I'm going to pick between the two, I am usually going to go for Murmur, because obviously she's a hell of a lot easier to get your hands on, right? Again, you don't have to complete her Constellation. You also have really easy access to the 6 blue. You only need to put 4 points there. Boom, there's poison acid resistance. We still have 4 points left over. If you pull these points out of the Abomination's hands, you've got 6 points left over. You can still put some points into the Magi. If you're using a ranged weapon, you can still put some points into the Hydra. You've got options, right? But, generally speaking, that is going to be the constellations I generally use for the various builds of the Witchblade that I talked about in the preceding episode. So, with that being said, that's going to be it for this specific episode. Thank you all very much for joining me. If you liked this, please like and subscribe. If you didn't, please ignore me. And if you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, or requests, please leave them down in the comment section below. And thank you all very much for joining me, and have a great 24 hours.